In Salem, Oregon, we have the Citizens Initiative Review process, it's a pretty neat example of what you can do. This is just a picture of the state capitol. Let me give you a little context for Oregon. 1902, they established the referendum and initiative process. It was kind of a hip and sexy thing to do, but they were still early enough that they could say, like, we knew that band before you thought it was cool. So they were already passing some things by ballot that were pretty revolutionary. Women's suffrage in 1912 was done through the ballot in Oregon. They abolished the death penalty in 1914, and many, many other ballot measures on taxes, environment, health, crime, you name it, have come through the state of Oregon. So it was a great place to try a new deliberative process that could improve direct democracy. Now, again, this starts with kind of a person who had an idea. In this case, it gets a little more personal because it's actually a friend of mine. Ned Crosby here. Let me show you a picture of him. No. The next one, not that Crosby. Ned Crosby. There we go. Okay. Slide error. My mistake. The Jefferson Center for New Democratic Processes, he started back in 1974 and created something called the Citizens Jury. If you study this deliberation stuff, that'll come up pretty quickly, that term, and like participatory budgeting, it's copied, sometimes with weird sci-fi effects, but it's copied all over the world. It's one of the most commonly used terms to describe a deliberative body in countries that have a jury system, because again, the jury is something we can connect to and say, oh, like a jury. Well, yeah, kind of, sort of. But you do what you can when you're working with metaphors. When we look at the history, we have to fast forward from 1974 all the way to 2009. And the reason we have to take so long is Ned worked on these citizen juries on policy questions for years and years and years. Eventually, he became frustrated. He felt like they weren't having necessarily an impact. They weren't necessarily connected to real electoral outcomes. And he created this process that a couple folks in Oregon with public policy degrees said sounded cool. And they got the legislature to adopt it. They just lobbied the heck out of the thing. An interesting detail is the legislature passed it in 2009, right? Everybody's broke. So they say, we'll establish this process, but we won't give you a dime. You're going to have to pay for it through philanthropic fundraising and so on, which they've done, but it's just a little worry note to plant there. So 2010, they did the CIR. We're going to see that in a second. And in 2011, Oregon, with a perfectly divided legislature in at least one house, then is going to review it because they passed it for just one try to be, sunsetted and then looked at again later. So let's take a look at what this process actually looked like.
Reflects the entire state election got over 5 days to review and measure on development. Through the process, I never knew who was Republican or who was a Democrat.
We have always felt educational levels of every committed to the process and contributed in powerful and valuable ways.
Always persevered for the facts and issues. For each 5-day review, a panel directly questioned campaigns for and against the election, heard from background experts, and then deliberated together based on the facts. These issues are findings every voter in the state to a problem to change in the statewide voter system.
So this is just a picture of the little ending press conference here. I just want to reiterate what exactly it is they did. You're voting as an Oregon voter on all kinds of questions, and it's actually a vote by mail state now. So you get these ballots along with a voter's guide, and you have to vote on policy, on a lot of different and sometimes very complex policies. The CIR got to study a couple of those, 2 different panels, 2 different issues, for a full week, and really grill the proponents and the opponents of these measures. Measure 73 is the one we're going to look at, and at the end of their week, they did a press conference and issued their kind of findings and observations. But like so many of these processes, if they end with a press conference, you might as well have not done it. It was covered a little bit here and there. I mean, what's the news value? The point was that voter's pamphlet. That's the incredible innovation here. These are mailed to, again, every registered household. And historically, it's had some information, a little technical summary, an estimate of fiscal impact. But now there was a new page written by your fellow citizens who studied the bejesus out of this thing a lot longer than you're going to have time to do. And they came up with some insights. Well, in the end, we found that about 40% of the Oregon electorate found out about this page. All right, so stay with me there. A majority of Oregonians actually never did quite reach that thing. So first time it was tried, didn't quite reach half, but we're up to 40%. That's about 4 times what we were getting when we started back in Kerala. Measure 73's support was incredibly high. It was a mandatory minimum law, and Oregon loves them some tough on crime. And this was tough on a couple crimes, drunk driving and sexual assaults. It was very unpleasant. And Oregonians loved the idea of tougher minimum sentences on that. Support for that measure dropped pretty dramatically in the course of the election. It didn't change the outcome in the end, but support dropped as you're going to see in a little bit. Did the CIR account for that? Did it have anything to do with that? Well, that's really part of what we were researching. We did some online surveys, and we did a ton of huge rolling cross-section phone surveys. So we surveyed the poor state to death. One of the interesting findings was just how carefully they read that page. When you ask them how much time they spent reading different things in the voter's guide, if they did see that CIR page, as about 42% did, they spent at least kind of twice as long reading that as they did anything else. All these old pieces of information, the explanatory summary, the arguments for and against which are literally bought and paid for in the voter's guide. That's exactly what they are. So they were reading it, but did that make any difference? Did it affect them? We did, the coolest experiment I think in this whole study was this. You're about to see in this slide, my favorite slide of the day. It was an experiment. In the online survey, when we were coming to people late in the election, so these are real voters in Oregon who are about to vote. They have their voter's guide, but they haven't voted yet. And they haven't read their voter's guide yet. We're going to, I just haven't gotten to it. Okay, well, we're interviewing you now, so answer some questions if you would, please. And this is a web survey, which is perfect. In the first condition that I call no treatment, that nothing happens. We just say, oh, so how are you going to vote on this measure, Measure 73, which has the following title? As you can see, almost 70%, roughly 2/3 are saying, I'm voting for it. I am tough on crime. Yeah. The second experimental condition, a different quarter of these people were randomly put in this condition where instead of being asked immediately how they're going to vote, they first saw this letter from the Secretary of State, which was completely irrelevant to the question we were about to ask. But in experiments, you do these things, so they have to read something. And then we ask them, and of course they say the same thing, right? This group also, 2/3 say, yeah, we're tough on crime. It's Oregon. We love it. Woo! Third condition gets the traditional voter guide information. We gave them a page. We said, whoop, we're not going to ask any questions until you read a summary of Measure 73 and the fiscal impact. Now what do you think? I love this. This is tough on crime. I'm all over it. You know where we're going. Of these people, 1/4 were randomly assigned to the Citizens Initiative review page. That was all they saw before we asked them the question. And here's your result. Yeah. The tide turns violently against Measure 73. Now, the story is actually more interesting than this. Reading the CIR page didn't just make almost 60% now opposed to it. It did a couple other things. When other people read the summary and the fiscal statement, they became incredibly confident that they now had the information they need to make an informed judgment. And they were very quick to say, yes, I support. When you ask a survey question like this, yes or no, you often get into these sort of, well, I'm not sure, okay, but if you had to. These people didn't need that. Yes, I support it. The people who read the CIR statement were no more confident that they had all the information that they needed. And were actually hesitant to say yes or no, but when pushed, would say, well, if you're going to push me, I got to say no. The burden of proof had shifted. It hadn't brainwashed them. It had just made them stop and think and say, hold on, maybe I don't know what Measure 73 really is. That, I would argue, is actually more valuable than simply just swaying them in the opposite direction. Well, no suspense. In 2011, when the legislature looked back at the CIR, they decided this is going to become a permanent institution in the state of Oregon. It passed the House 36-30-22 in a House that was 50-50 Democrat and Republican with co-speakers. In the Senate, a 16-14 divide, they voted 22-8 in favor. And then it was signed by the governor in June. It's pretty incredible that this thing has been secured in legislation. It might spread. It might. Arizona is having to come out in March to talk about this idea. Some folks in California are talking about it. But it is not without its blemishes. It didn't change any electoral outcomes. In both of the initiative cases, it shifted public opinion, but not to change the net result. So we have still yet to see that. And we don't know how well it will translate to other states. So let's kind of wrap up here just by kind of taking away a couple of sort of cocktail moment thoughts that you can take out of this talk to explain to people why you're so much smarter than them because you came here. Those are the 4 processes: the People's Plan, participatory budgeting, Citizens Assembly, Citizens Initiative Review. But you can kind of think of them in 2 clusters, as you probably already sensed. The first 2 of those They have a special constitutional foundation. Constitutional amendments kind of facilitated their arrival. Political parties seized on them at the right time and created a process that was designed for mobilization. And therein lies some of its challenge, that it really is kind of a political mobilization process, and it's only as strong as your political process is. The other two processes, again, use random samples, and that creates some of its own problem. On the one hand, it's a very representative body, and they have a very cool and structured process that they can do incredible analysis to either create legislation or very rigorously evaluate it. But there is no energy that comes out of it. There's no mobilization connected to it. So it's an open question as to whether the public will trust its judgment or bother to read its analysis. We go back to the quote from Francis Moore-Lepage to remind ourselves that we are creating this new democracy, this deliberative democracy, and to remind you again that the we, as I argue in these cases, is most effective when it really is inclusive. It's inclusive of people who are passionate about social change, passionate about personal transformation, and other people who are boring and are institutionalized or are politically strategic but not interested in mass mobilization. There can be alliances and partnerships among those people that can create incredible things. In some ways, we have them to thank for some of the democratic reforms we cherish already, but I think we'll have them to thank for the ones that are coming tomorrow. Thank you so much for coming here today.